today's speaker. Mr. Philip A. Shull is a consultant, an expert witness, an author, a speaker on international trade, food security, and economic market development. He began his lengthy career teaching English to students in China. He speaks Chinese and understands the country and its people from, shall I say, the ground up. 3 years later, he retired as a senior U.S. diplomat in 2016 after serving for over 30 years with the U.S. Foreign Agricultural Service. He directed offices in China, including Mongolia, Korea, Argentina, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Macau, as well as Minister Counselor for Agriculture at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. He's an experienced trade negotiator on bilateral and multilateral agricultural and food security issues, served as U.S. delegation leader and spokesman in meetings and conferences on various agricultural issues. All of his work has been towards advancing global food security and agricultural sustainability. So thank you so much for doing this, Phil. And I'm gonna disappear to you and I'll be back during the Q&A session.
All right. Well, then I will come on and assault your the audience and all the folks out there. You know, in this world of Zoom, I apologize for being this talking head. And I many times, as been on all these different Zoom meetings, I've thought of Harry Truman's, one of his favorite limericks, which went something like this: I know that no beauty I are, there are others more handsome by far, but my face, I don't mind it, for I am behind it. It's those out in front that I jar. So this is, I apologize to you for this, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Pat, thank you. Thanks, Chris and Steve, for all of your help in this. And I hope this will be of at least some interest to you. Pat did mention that I had my career in the Foreign Agricultural Service, which is the foreign service of the Department of Agriculture. A lot of people don't know that USDA actually is a member of the Foreign Service. And so let me just give a couple of minutes on what it does. The Foreign Ag Service has basically two roles, two missions, and that is to expand exports of all U.S. food and agricultural products, and also to promote global food security. And the way that we do that is, of course, to negotiate away trade barriers. We do analysis on the agricultural of the countries where we are. And we also do marketing promotion of U.S. ag products. So I'm going to be we talk a lot to U.S. companies and also help them interface with companies in the countries where we're based overseas. So that's basically what we do. Now, when it comes to China and this talk, I want to first talk about some of the forming influences of China and how it has affected its culture and its all of its foreign policy and domestic policy, even through to today. I want to underscore for you and show you some pictures of how China has succeeded wildly in achieving food security. I'm then going to talk about a little bit about its importance and sort of sporadic importance and disappointment as a market for exporters of food and ag products. And I'm talk specifically about some challenges in U.S. food and ag trade. And finally, talk about what are some of our challenges we have in dealing with this dragon that's out there. And finally, I'm going to close with an essay that one of my students wrote, and I'll illustrate that with some slides, technology permitting. But, you know, in the past, when I was in China and had 2 minutes to brief a congressional delegation that was coming in, or to talk to a group of business people or talk to the Chamber of Commerce, what I would always say is that one of the most important things to understand about China is you can see it from its word for population, which is comprised of the characters person and mouth. Because scarcity, and especially food scarcity, more than anything else, is what has shaped and influenced China's past. And you can see it in the language. So as I said, we talk about per capita, which comes from the Greek per head, right? China, one person, one mouth. And I tell you, I would love to see a psychological study done and see if a different part of the brain lights up when somebody says, how many mouths are there in the world? Or we have to feed all the mouths in this country, as opposed to what is the per capita consumption of meat in this country? At least with me, I can feel it hits me in a different part of when somebody says that. So that's one example. Another example is their word for wealth. The character for wealth is comprised of, they're called radicals in Chinese, but the radical for roof, and then one, and then mouth, and then field. So wealth is having a roof over your head and an entire field to feed just one mouth. That's the word for wealth. So you can see how that is there. And of course, China was like in the West, came from an agricultural background. And we, of course, in English have a lot of things that spill over today, even though nobody lives on a farm anymore. We still talk about, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and what's the pecking order, and these kinds of things. Hold your horses. I mean, all of these things that we have, inherited from our agricultural ancestors. China has that. Another, though, really, even down to the greeting, in the Chinese colloquial way of saying hello is, have you eaten yet? And like in the US, we say, well, how are you? How's the family? And why do we do that? And in fact, almost every Western language, we inquire about health. And if we're toasting, it's cheers, or it's your health in many languages. In China, they say, have you eaten yet? And they always answer yes, even if they haven't. Just as in the West, we say, how are you? We say, fine. One of the way, why is that? Well, in China, starvation was the great leveler. Lots of people starved to death over Chinese history. In the West, why do we inquire about health? Well, I think it's probably because it was disease that wiped out our ancestors more than starvation. And so that's why we're always asking about health. The other thing that has been so formative in China, in addition to its food scarcity, is and how it has shaped its attitude toward agriculture in the world today, is its attitude or its experience as a global leader. It was the big honcho there for about 1,000 years, and yet then beginning toward the end of the Qing dynasty, it was falling to pieces, and the West came in and was able to, 5 or 6 powers were sending their gunboats up and down the rivers of the Yangtze. Imagine how we would feel if we had 5 or 6 different powers sending their navies up and down the Mississippi River, or the Ohio, or any of those places, and had enclaves where extraterritoriality was. This was a tremendous humiliation, and something that they felt very deeply, and even today are trying to recover from. The notion of scarcity also had a tremendous impact on their idea of what does it mean to be successful or to be an individual? As I learned in one of my, at the Foreign Service Institute at the State Department, in Chinese culture, there is really no such thing as an individual. You are someone's mother or father, you're someone's aunt or uncle, you're someone's brother or sister, you're someone's son or daughter, and each one of these tendrils, each one of these relationships brings with it some level of responsibility. So I can walk by you starving on the street in China and feel no obligation to give you anything, because either you have done something so terrible that it has severed all of those relationships that where people are, all these people that are supposed to be taking care of you, or our values are falling apart. But I need to cling on to my values. And so I have to maintain this web. And what this brings into conflict is this idea that we must, as I must, as an individual, have economic security. And so if I can take a bribe, or if I can overcharge or somehow get something, well, that is, in a way, that's okay. And that's one reason why Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign has been so successful, and because everybody's guilty of corruption in some way. What I want to do now is move, if I can here, to just show you some pictures of how China has achieved global food security. And even as China's economic success has burgeoned, still every year, and I won't swear the last 2 years, but up until the last 2 years, the central government puts out something called the #1 policy document, which lays out everything, all the priorities of the government. And the first topic they have dealt with since the first one came out was agriculture. And that is, again, just shows the lingering influence of agriculture on this now rapidly industrializing and rapidly urbanizing country. So I'm just going to show you how they did this, because it's one of the great feats in human history, really. So let's keep our fingers crossed that I'm going to be able to share this screen with you. Can you see it? Krista, can you? All right, excellent. Okay, well, this is just showing the per capita income, but keep this shape in mind as we go through, because one of the realities that is now true around the world today is that income is the greatest determinant on hunger or lack of hunger. A person is, we say a customer, really comprised of three things: a person with money and access to the product. If one of those things is missing, you don't have a customer. And today, because of our technology and transportation, our ability to fly things and ship things all around the world with refrigerated containers, if you are hungry in the world today, it's because you don't have adequate funds. It's not because we're not producing enough food. We produce, the globe and the international trading system have out there way more food than so that everybody can eat. So let me just go through this if I can. So here is, just shows what they have done with soybeans. Now the soybeans are of course a critical part of feed as well as food. And the green line shows trade. And so you can see that China, for up until about 1992, it had a self-sufficiency policy in soybeans, but then it made the policy decision that it would buy soybeans it needs from the international market. The yellow line shows production. The gray line is consumption. So you can see how China today it takes about 60% of the global market in soy, and that's what all the other commodities and all the other exporters of everything are dreaming about. Oh, we as the walnut exporters want to be the next soybean. But you can see how that happened, and watch how it contrasts with this next one. So here again, China has, almost since its inception, maintained the PRC's inception, maintained a self-sufficiency policy for food grains. It didn't want to depend on the world for its food supply. And so that's why you see it along the bottom, to the great consternation of US and other farmers around the world. They thought they would be exporting to China. And when I was in China the first time as an ag attaché in the late 80s, we predicted that, well, yes, China will eventually become a major importer of corn because there's no way it's going to be able to keep up as it continues to develop. But look what they did. That yellow line of production, they managed to continue to increase through double cropping, through introducing other agricultural technology, putting on huge amounts of pesticide and fertilizer. They managed to really maintain, and it's only been in the last couple years they've suddenly started to increase corn. And in fact, what they did was they reclassified corn as a non-food grain, which was very, very interesting. They reclassified it in that way. So rice, here we go again. Look how China has continued its rice, and that's been pretty much on the same line, and an undependable market for the world's rice exporters. Wheat, again, another food grain. People tend to think of China as a rice-eating culture, but in the north it's wheat, and in the south it's rice. So all those noodles and the breads and everything that they have, the steamed buns and so on, that's there. So you can see what's happened there. But again, the consumption is following much along the line of the income rise. But of course, especially with corn and soybeans, the big driver of that consumption is increasing meat, because it's the animals that can start consuming large amounts of corn and soybeans. Pork, China is the largest pork producer in the world by a long shot. And you can see again how just small increases. Look at the tiny difference toward the end between the gray and the yellow lines, but how that had an impact on that green line. So suddenly, even though you have a tiny little increase percentage-wise in demand exceeding the supply for pork, the impact on the world market for imports, including from the US, is huge. Now, with that little bit, China's taking almost 50% of the world pork trade. Beef, again, this is really tied to income. You can see how toward the end that consumption goes way up. Poultry, again, China, when I was in there again in the late 80s, into the 90s, we would refer to Sichuan as the land of 100 million people and 100 million pigs, because every family had one or two pigs. And that is one of the big things that's changing. There's a lot more concentrated production of animal agriculture. This also has had a huge impact on the grain trade, because if you are just a backyard farmer and you are feeding food scraps to your pigs and chickens, you are invisible to the world market. The world market doesn't know you exist. But if I give that up, and now I'm going to go become a construction worker in Shanghai. Shanghai is food deficit. I'm not raising my pigs and chickens there. Now everything I consume has a direct trace back to the world market. And this is one reason why urbanization in China has also been a major driver. Again, into the 1980s, well into the 1980s, roughly 80% of China's population lived in rural areas, and today it's well under 50%. And again, it's not only a large consumer, it's also the largest producer of meat. Look at that blue line is the US. China produces almost twice as much meat as the United States does. And the major suppliers there, you can see we used to be the major suppliers. This is where you can see how politics can jump in there a bit. Brazil has overtaken the US as the #1 supplier of agricultural products. Now, again, Brazil, that's going to be primarily soybeans and corn. And we can talk a bit about how the Trump administration policy affected our exports and what impact that had in terms of our overall exports. This area we talk about consumer-oriented food products. This shows again how increasing income has affected the market. Think when you see consumer-oriented products, just think about what you buy in a grocery store. So you can see how that's also increased dramatically over time. And it's ag imports from the world, again, bulk commodities, that's the wheat, the corn, the soybeans, those big things, those raw materials. And you can see how now consumer-oriented for the first time has passed that. So that shows, again, perhaps some of this, the dream of every exporter about the wonders of the China market is perhaps beginning to be realized, but politics can turn that off in a snap of the fingers. But again, one of the ways that China has been able to maintain its productivity on just a tiny amount of arable land. I mean, the US has more than twice the amount of arable land that China does, and yet China has, through double cropping and sometimes triple cropping, managed to exceed grain production in the US, especially of a number of commodities like rice and wheat. It's been just huge, and corn. So here we have, again, you can compare it to India and the US, the amount of fertilizer consumption. Of course, this has terrible effects for the environment and groundwater and other things, and we can talk about that later if you like. So that's it. Now I'm going to cross my fingers that I can come back and see you again. Am I there? Oh, Krista, love that thumbs up. That is just great. Okay. Now, yeah, let me make this point. One of the things I got to do when I was the minister counselor in China was JP Morgan invited me to appear on a panel, and I was on a panel up there with like the head of Cartier, Mercedes-Benz, some huge real estate companies and so on. And because I did agriculture, of course, I was the last one on the panel to speak. And each one of these people that went before me talked about how over the last 10 years, their portion of China's economy had increased. And it made me throw out everything I planned to say, because what I said then was, well, I can say with absolute certainty that over these past 10, 15 years of China's miraculous economic achievements, agriculture's portion of the Chinese economy has shrunk. But that's the sign of its success, because it is only when we produce enough food that prices of that food can begin to come down, and that leaves money to buy this $2,000 watch this guy over here is selling. So even if you look in well, in China, when I was in China as a teacher at the university in 1981, the average person spent well over 90% of his or her income on food. Wasn't room for anything else. Even if you can look at, and then today it's less than 50%. All right, so that's what and again, this is per capita, and of course, that we all know about how that can mask big disparities. But in the United States, back around 1900, the average person spent about 50% of their income on food. I remember when I was in college starting to study this stuff, the average family spent about 18% of its income on food. Today, it's under 10%. And so that's what has, this is just a kind of a side comment that agriculture's success, despite how we've managed technology, has allowed us to postpone that Malthusian nightmare and keep food affordable. And China has also been a beneficiary of that. Okay. One of the things, moving into some of the challenges that we've had, again, let's look back at Chinese culture. Under China, for centuries, the emperor decided the law, just like in merry old England, off with his head. If the king said it, if the emperor said it, that was done. Whatever the leader says, whatever the official says is law. They had absolute authority. And this has been a very long and entrenched position. And even today, there's this question of how you mold this old idea of an official almost being able to make up law on the spot with commitments to the WTO has been a real challenge. I mean, when I was teaching in China, I taught at a school of science and technology. It was one of the finest schools in China, in Hangzhou, a place called Zhejiang University. And so all of these students were future scientists, and they gave me a book that said it was about scientific English, and it was from England. And the opening paragraph said a scientist is determined by his belief in facts. He doesn't care about the position of the person who's giving an opinion. He wants to look at facts. And so I said, for example, you are all scientists. If Deng Xiaoping came into our classroom today and said the sky is green, what would you say? And a kid in the back of the class yelled out, yes. And what that means, and of course the whole class cracked up because they were all thinking, no, I'd say yes. Yeah, I'd say yes, I would. And this is one of the things that is just true. And in fact, again, we always think, well, that wouldn't happen in America. Well, really? I mean, Pat and I all of us were kidding before about working with ambassadors. How many of us in a country team meeting, if the ambassador says something that is wrong, how many of us were going to say, well, I'm sorry, ma'am, that's just not right, and you're completely out to lunch? It's much the same. You have to pick your battles, and just in China, it's more so. So when we think of China, stop think of these, was Winston Churchill talked about Russia. What did he say? It was a mystery, an enigma wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And a lot of people think the same about China, that it somehow will never understand it. It's upside down. Well, really, we're concentric circles. We're not separate circles. And so when we deal with this notion of rule of law, and China, where China has had rule by law, they're faced with this challenge of how do they bring these two together? Rule by law, meaning if it's law, if I make the law, then that's what it is, and that's okay the world's regulations or WTO be damned, that doesn't matter. But, and the way China has done this, in some ways, it's kind of ingenious. They will create a regulation or a standard that no one can meet, and then give the official the option, or the government the option, on whether to enforce it. So how does this happen with today's standards, zero tolerance? Well, let's say your Pat is running a restaurant, and the standard we have in the government is no germs on that table, and none of your customers can have any germs on their hands. That's zero. Germs make us sick. We know that's bad. We can't be there. But, and we happen to have to help us out, this state-of-the-art instrument that will measure whether there's anything there. And this thing can measure in parts per billion. So obviously no one can meet it. So, but the official comes in and says, well, Pat, you've been, I guess you've been okay. All right, well, it looks pretty clean. Let's go. Krista, let's go over to your place. Oh, you've been to complain to the American embassy, or, oh, you've done this. We're just gonna shine this instrument right here. And I'm sorry, you don't pass. You're welcome to wash your hands again, but if you can't get down to zero germs, then we're just going to shut you down for a year. And that's, of course, what happens. And you see this happening in all kinds of ways, in everything. China will have, in a big Panamex of wheat or soybeans or corn, a zero tolerance on for, let's say, a noxious weed seed. Now, it's impossible. If you've ever seen how a combine goes through a field, there's going to be stuff in there. If you look hard enough, you're going to find it. And that's why the grain contracts always allow for, say, 2% foreign material or something like that. And but China, this is what they use. And when they need the grain, then they will say, "No, it looks pretty good. Come on in." But if they are mad at us, if we've done something, or as Australia did, as Australia criticized China over COVID, then China will say, "Oh no, we've got to look at this grain. Sorry, your wheat is banned, your beef is banned from Australia, your wine is banned," and that's what they did. And we've had that same issue. So that's just kind of the reality, and everyone knows it. And at the same time, what they have as rules, they are just as they can ignore them. For a long time, you might remember we had mad cow disease in the US, and China banned our beef imports for a couple of decades. And many late nights in negotiations on that. And they just weren't going to, on paper, not allow it to come in. And yet there was a lot of it flooding in over the border from Hong Kong. In fact, the joke in the trade was that, well, China's banned our beef, so it's only our 4th largest market in the world. You could even go to restaurants in cities that were advertising US beef promotion. So sometimes I have to think, when we are there sweating it out across the negotiating table at 2 a.m, they're saying, what are they talking about? Why are they doing? We're already letting it in. I mean, why do they care so much about it? And again, this can be a contradiction that, they're kind of scratching their heads, and yet here we are. And but also just understanding, and this is a great frustration for our exporters, not only in agriculture, but it extends to other areas, where they will just link progress on one area to another. China told us very early on that they weren't going to eliminate their ban on US beef until we allowed in their cooked poultry, okay? And so, and so our chief veterinary officer, who was there with the negotiation, said, well, that's not based on science. We can't do that. I mean, their chicken plants have not met our standards. So, you know, it's got to be based on this. And so with mad cow disease, it's tied to the age of the animal. If the animal, it doesn't develop in an animal till it's at least 9 or 10 years old. Well, all the beef we're sending to China or anywhere else in the world is about 2 years old, roughly, and maybe up to 30 months. And so during the negotiations, the Chinese said, well, we are not going to let in your beef from any animal unless you can certify the age of that animal. And our chief veterinary officer said, okay, to what level? And he said, well, to the nearest month. And the chief veterinarian, okay, no problem. He said, really? Why? What do you mean no problem? I said, well, we thought you said you couldn't know the age. And he said, well, we can't know it to the day because there are animals out in Wyoming and Colorado that are dropping calves on the plains. And so we don't know exactly how old they are, but we can certify to the nearest month. You can? Oh, okay, let's have a break. They come back after the break and said, our policy is you must certify to the day. And he got, this guy from Kentucky, he got so red in the face, he stood up and under the table. But this is just again, a contradiction. And they told us early on, this is the link. If you want your beef, you want us to lift restrictions on our beef, you need to lift restrictions on our poultry. And yet we rejected that. And so we negotiated till 3 in the morning and ended up with nothing, even though it was clear from the beginning what was going to happen. So these are the kinds of things that are difficult. And again, you know, what's another point on this is, again, just how many of us grew up in China believing that China was very centralized, the communism very centralized. A peasant out in the boonies didn't sneeze without Chairman Mao knowing about it. Well, in fact, China is one of the most decentralized governments that I have ever lived in. And all of the people, experienced exporters to China, knew it. In fact, they would say, I remember being with one importer, I was having lunch with him, and there was a ship was docking, and he got on the phone and said, yes, okay, good, it's docking. What? He said, no, not berth 5, it has to dock at berth 6. That's where it must have docked. That's where everything's been worked out. We can't let it go anywhere else. Or sometimes a ship would dock in one place, in one port, like say in Shanghai, be rejected. So the ship would then try Tianjin to see if they could get the product in there. In another case, something as seemingly straightforward as a tariff. I remember one of the largest US French fry exporters came into my office and was saying, well, I want to export French fries. We think it's time. What's the tariff on French fries? And I said, well, do you want to know what the book says, or do you want to know what people pay? And he said, well, it's got to be the same. And I said, well, I'll bet you lunch on that one. And so we went across town to a state-owned hotel. If any of you have been to Guangzhou, the White Swan Hotel, that's where we were. Talked to the food and beverage director and said, what tariff do you pay on French fries? And he said, 0. Well, how do you pay 0? The tariff's 44%. He said, well, we have a very good relationship with the customs people. And then we went across again to the newly opened Holiday Inn, just a mile or two away, and said, what tariff do you pay on French fries? And he said, well, it's 100%. I said, you pay 100%? Why do you pay 100%? The tariff's just 44. He said, well, we just opened. We haven't had time to develop a good relationship with the customs people. So this is the kind of la-la, never, never land that the whole world that's trying to deal with China has to reckon with. And it can be very frustrating. I was lucky early in my career to meet a local manager of the Heinz plant there. And this happened to be in Korea, but it applies to many places. He gave me two kernels of wisdom that were fantastic. One was, if the relationship's not good, the contract won't save you. The relationship's not good, the contract won't save you. That is so true. And the last thing anybody wants to do is get into a legal battle in another country. And the second one was, if the relationships, the signing of the contract marks the beginning of the negotiations. The signing of the contract. And so this is another thing. We also fight the fact, again, with general rule of law and international institutions, that China is working hard to be a leader of now, in many cases, to sort of exert its prestige in the world, something it feels it's earned. They don't feel a lot of allegiance because they weren't there at the creation, to take I think it was the Dean Acheson phrase. They were not there at the creation. They had nothing to do with the founding of the World Bank or the So, the powers, those same powers that were running your ships up and down our rivers and subjecting us, to all this humiliation, our great country to this humiliation, and our great culture to this humiliation. We weren't there, so why should we pay attention to this stuff? And so that's been an issue. Let me move quickly to this notion of how do we deal with this government, this kind of trade behemoth, and this economic behemoth that's very, very shortly is expected to exceed the economy of the US and be the largest economy in the world. To me, it is by joining with allies to try to keep China on the straight and narrow. China loves to divide and conquer. When I was, one of my most successful methods of dealing with Chinese in this was to join together with my counterparts in other embassies, and we would go in together to complain about a certain issue. China, as I said, China loves to divide and conquer, and they are so huge that if they're sitting at a table with only Vietnam, or with only France, or with only India, they can really loom very large. We're one of the few that can sort of go toe to toe with them. And they are happy to sacrifice and block our trade. If something's not going right, they're happy to turn the screws. For them, trade is a policy tool. It is not something that's distinct and is dealt with here. It is a policy tool that that they use, and I've had some conversations, outside the negotiating room. They say, why don't you, be a little tougher in these things? Why do you keep these things? You could, the US is so big, you could do anything, and you don't have to worry about that WTO rule with that. And that's honestly how they feel. So we need to join together to keep China on and try to be sure that it will do it, but do it in an intelligent way, which means really, because China, it's arrogant, but it's also insecure because of what it's done and because of its recent history. It is acutely aware that other countries have and still are richer, certainly on a per capita basis than it is. And so it's acknowledging their place, their presence, their achievements. They're really, when I, again, lived in China in the early 80s, I was, a good 5 inches taller. I'd get on a bus and I could see over everyone's head. Today, I'm looking in their necks. I mean, it's truly astonishing what they have done. And so we need to recognize that. But also we need to be smart about knowing what their weak spots are and what their hot buttons are, and avoid them where we can, but also use them where we can. And prestige and keeping face is one of those areas, and a very recent example of how where China has bent to international pressure, not even from governments, but from the tennis world. When Peng Shuai was disappeared for accusing a former vice premier of sexual assault, the tennis world got behind her and said, we may not show up at the Olympics unless we see her. And guess what? They did. They bent to that. And that is just a classic example of a way that China can be pressured. But in other things, it's can't. But it's understanding where those hot buttons are and trying to help them. This mixture of carrots and sticks. And let's face it, all countries, including ours, at times needs a stick to bring us back into line as well. But we have so much in common with China. This is why I use the common ground notion, that we have this, we share this world. We're there with the two largest economies together. We are putting out a huge majority of the pollution, and we also put a huge proportion of the output. And so the world will be better off if we can work together in a constructive way. It's to me such a shame that the Trans-Pacific Partnership fell away, that when President Trump came to power, he took us out of that. We had gotten a lot of great benefits from that on the agriculture side, and China was not a part of it. It was a way to put us in, and I think it's the height of irony now that China has applied to join that group, and we aren't. But I don't worry about China in agriculture or in anything else supplanting us, the U.S. as a global leader, because of how it behaves. I mean, it is so overtly, it so overtly uses its trade policies and even its supposed development initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative in a self-serving way. There is a reason why around the world there are still a lot of Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy streets and boulevards and parks all around the world. It will be a cold day and where before there is a Xi Jinping park or street anywhere else, simply because of and I'll use this term in sort of the selfish or self-serving way that they do their aid projects. A couple of things. Food safety is always an issue that comes up, and again, getting back to this whole notion, as I mentioned before, on the not being an individual. And what that means is that if I poison you to get ahead, well, that's okay, because I need that. I saw a fantastic line I read once, that the most honest business person in the world is the village baker. And it made a lot of sense when you think about it, because if you're the village baker, you are selling to the same people every day. And not only that, your customers are your neighbors. And our kids are playing together, we're all going to the PTA and so on. But with globalization, if I never see my customer, and that's in some other country, it's a very different situation. All I have to do is cheat you once and I can move to the next guy. I mean, I don't know if you've found the time to renew your car warranty, but boy, I've had the opportunity, and I've done it about 35 times just in the last week. I mean, it's just crazy out there, right? But you know, this happened to me in China. Again, the assumptions we make, and this is where, again, another plug for the Department of Agriculture here, that even those who are libertarians who think government is bad, they go to the grocery store and they're pretty confident that what they buy is they're not going to die from. And that is not the case in China. And that's one reason why our demand for our products have increased, because the Chinese have way more confidence in the products we sell than the products they buy from their own people. And this is way back. I had just met my future wife. We've been dating for a bit, and I invited her to dinner. And so I thought, well, the easiest thing is to go to the market and just get a chicken and put it in the oven. And so I was surprised to go to the market and see that the price for a live chicken was twice the price of that for a dead chicken or a dressed chicken ready to go. And here this guy in front of me is buying a live chicken. And I asked him in Chinese, I said, excuse me, can you just tell me why you're buying a live chicken when it's so much hassle? And he said, he looked at me, he said, if I kill it, I know how it died. And that was like, wow, okay, this is something I'd never considered, those assumptions we have. And so a couple of years later then, maybe 3 years later, we had a baby by this time. And I was living in Guangzhou, and which is the old canton right above Hong Kong. And we would get reports coming up from Hong Kong occasionally about people getting sick from pesticide on the vegetables and the fruits. And I, because of my work, one of my very best contacts, and really still a good friend today, was the head of the Guangdong Quarantine Service. And I called him, I said, Dr. Chen, we're getting some reports from in the Hong Kong papers about people getting sick from the pesticide on the produce. Is that a problem? He said, oh yes, it's a problem. And I said, well, what about in the local markets? Is that a problem? He said, yes, it is. He said, you see, the farmers, before they take their produce to the market, they'll spray it with pesticide, because the first thing it does is it kills the insects, but it also makes the fruit nice and shiny so they can sell it for a higher price. I thought, oh my gosh, well, what do you do? He said, well, there are two things you can do. First of all, he said, luckily, the half-life on the toxicity of the pesticide they use is not that long. So if you keep it in your refrigerator for a couple of days and wash it well, you'll probably be okay. I said, all right, what's the other thing? He said, well, what I do what I do. He said, you go to the market and you only buy the vegetables with insects on them. So there you go. It's again, wow. It's one of the great things, as we know, about living over the world, is you get exposed to different mindsets and different ways of doing things and new ways. But I hope that this has helped to some degree. I look forward to your questions. But what I want to do last is actually read for you an essay that one of my students wrote back in 1981. And why do I want to do that? Well, first of all, I think it's an amazing essay. I haven't changed a word in it, but it's to show how China has gone up and down. And I think it shows great insight into how a lot of people there approach the government and how they approach life. And it reflects a little bit about what they've been through. Remember, I mean, if let's say our grandparents, anybody born in 1900, if they lived till 1980, what they would have seen was the demise of a 300-year-old dynasty. They would have had Sun Yat-sen coming to power, but it was it was really almost a warring states period. They had warlord period. Nobody really controlled the country. It was nasty. Then you had a horrifically brutal Japanese invasion. Tens of millions of people killed. Then you had a time of a civil war where millions more are killed, and the communists come to power, and things in some ways are a brand new day. As I was saying to Pat before we started, one of the great things that Chairman Mao did, apart from starting the food security and land reform, was to greatly improve the status of women. One of his most famous sayings was, "Women hold up half the sky." And the divorce was allowed, and women were given economic independence and status. It was really, wasn't all a bad thing. And yet, he also launched, out of his own insecurity and wanting to cling to power, the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, which ended up caused 20 to 40 million people to die of starvation. It was an unbelievably, horrifically cruel policy. And then after that, you had the Cultural Revolution, where people were beaten up and taken and, better read than expert. In other words, any scientist, it was Pol Pot took that and magnified it times 100. But he learned from Chairman Mao and the Red Guards during the Great Leap Forward. It was just a horrific time. And of course, so today, Xi Jinping is old enough, okay, say if you're 60 or 70 today, you would have remembered that time and all of the other chaos of the Great Leap Forward. You might have seen your father, as his was, taken out, beaten up, persecuted. My office at the university was on the 3rd floor. It was a holding room for some prisoners from the other faction. They would take people, swing them around, open the window sometimes and let them go. Sometimes they'd slam into the wall. Sometimes they'd sail out the window. And these were people that still had to work together. Just 10 years later, I was there because there was no freedom of movement. You couldn't just change your job. So it's a tremendously chaotic time. So this essay is written with that in mind. Soon after that ended, and as China, China in the 80s, with Deng Xiaoping rising and introducing these reforms, was it was much like the 50s in the US. It's just the rise, and technology is going to save us, and it was a time of great optimism. So let me hope that I can share this screen with you. Is that working? Krista, okay, good. Let's wait for it to come in. So this is quite the essay again, and the title of it is "A Dream Coming True?" with a question mark. The size of our population had long been viewed as a proof of our strength. Nowadays, mere manpower is no longer a deterrent. We would be the strongest were there no backfire bombers, MX missiles, nuclear submarines, and neutron bombs. But now this one-time national asset makes everyone worry. The fast increasing population has become a major obstacle to the economic development. Therefore, our government, which 20 years ago denounced the new population theory of Mr. Ma Ying-jeou so vehemently, calls on every couple to have only one child. Our long and colorful history had long been a much bragged of national legacy. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a mixed blessing. Thousands of years of feudal rule created splendid ancient civilizations and a nation well fit for a closed natural economy. It also left a wealth of heavy shackles and fetters, which are still hindering our progress. Consequently, we are ill prepared to the advent of a fiercely competitive modern world. Even our system, which was believed to be superior to those of other countries, failed to operate normally. The administrative machines were rusty. Many officials are ignorant of their own jobs. In many places, nepotism prevails, and sycophants easily take all kinds of plums, while really talented men are disliked and persecuted. After so many years of disappointment, the future begins to look bright. Our government is now controlled by those who dare to advocate and carry out some reforms which were wildly impossible only a few years ago. Local elections are being held. Open criticisms of corrupting and incapable cadres are published on papers. A lot of measures to expedite the snailing economy are taken. Among them are free markets, factory self-management, smaller farming units, and joint ventures. Intellectuals, the majority of whom were classified as an inferior category, are being flattered. The government also loosened its control over films, dramas, and books to a certain degree. Though the pace is slow, after all, it is the first time we pull our heads out of the sand and begin to do something meaningful. Hopefully, our country will get rid of her backwardness and poverty by the beginning of the next century, and our life will become prosperous and colorful. It's true that there are still so many doubts and uncertainties, and so many enemies who come at night and conquer by stealth. But if the present trend of reform continues, there is hope. Besides, we have survived the great cultural revolution. Can it become worse? So that is the wisdom from 1981. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Are you there?
We're here. We can hear you.
Oh, I had to stop sharing. Okay. And I'm trying to, get out of this now. I'm sorry. Here we go. Here we go. I think I can do this, and you're back. All right, good. So that's it. Those are some remarks, a bit, I hope they're helpful, but I'm happy to try and answer questions if you have any.